Qorvex has always been a good Warframe. However, now in 2025, he's received an augment that makes him even better, but also super darn slow. I mean, like, for real, he's basically a radioactive snail now, but guess what? Your boy might have just found a fix for that. So, in today's build guide, I'm gonna show you what exactly has changed about Mr. Radiation right here, and of course, how you can take your Qorvex to the next level and absolutely destroy everything. Big shout out to all our generous channel members who help me keep the lights on, and now let's jump right into it. But you know what? As per usual, let's start out talking a little bit about Qorvex's skills. However, given the fact that we already spoke about him when he came out, we're not going to go through everything in great detail, just a quick overview, but then I want to focus a bit more about what has changed, especially given his brand new augment. So let's jump right into it. First of all, his passive, you get punched through with your weapons. It's kinda nice, but with today's build, you're most likely not going to use many weapons, so it's not that applicable. Ability number 1 is called Chirinka Pillar, which is a nice ability for some crowd control and status application. You put down a pillar, it puts radiation on enemies in an AoE, you can have 2 of them on the field, they have a good base duration, so especially for stationary missions, it's really darn good. Ability number 2 is called Containment Wall, and this is mainly there to group up enemies. It also makes them more vulnerable to your damage, which is nice. Plus, it has an augment that gives it armor stripping capabilities, meaning it is a nice package. I personally find myself using it quite a bit. However, given the fact that it doesn't group enemies up in one blob, but in one line, it's a bit cringe to play, and I can totally understand why a lot of people also just don't want to use it. Ability number 3, Disymmetric Guard. Disymmetric Guard, I don't even know how to pronounce this. This baby right here is basically just Mesmer Skin ordered on Wish. It doesn't give you any protection to your health or shields, however it does negate status effects, which can be really useful depending on which content you're playing and which enemy faction you're up against. But even though I know a lot of players really like this ability, it kinda sorta never resonated with me personally. Not saying it's a bad ability, it definitely has its applications, just that I don't like it all too much. However, let's now talk about his big bad ultimate, the 4th ability, Crucible Blast, and this thing really slaps. You shoot out a big fat laser that applies tons of radiation to the enemies that you're hitting with it, and it's gonna cause a chain reaction of explosions, dealing massive damage whenever enemies are grouped tightly together. However, it is not all that great against a single target. One thing to note here, while you're casting it, you're completely invincible, so that's definitely very nice. However, up until now, this has always been an ability that you cast once for a lot of energy, and then you blast your laser for a second or two, and then it was over. But with the recent Techradon Core update, we have received a brand new augment called Fused Crucible, and this is really darn cool because it turns this ability from a one-time cast into a channeled ability where you switch it on and then this laser just continues forever as long as you want it to, or until the energy runs out, consuming 20 energy per second, but becoming continuously more expensive per second the longer you keep it on. Now, all in all, this is very straightforward, essentially means you can keep your 4 on as long as possible, but now you can also move around in it, similar to Mesa's augment, but in order for it to not become too overpowered, the devs made sure that the movement speed will be very, very, very slow. Don't worry though, we're gonna fix that. Just one more thing here that I found kinda weird. Usually, on other Warframes, when you have a channeled ability, then the energy cost per second is affected by your duration. However, for this specific Qorvex augment, duration doesn't do anything for your energy cost per second, neither positive nor negative, and the drain is only affected by your ability efficiency. Don't know if that's intentional, just saying that building duration for this skill won't really get you anywhere at the moment. And as always, if you could maybe leave a like for the video, that would be mwah, chef's kiss, so cheers so much for your support. But now that we refreshed our memories when it comes to his abilities and also talked about his new augment, let's finally take a look at the build, going over first how this thing is actually played in practice, and luckily this is very, very easy. For this build, of course, we're gonna use the augment for his 4, which not only allows us to have our 4 on constantly and deal massive damage everywhere, but we can also now move around. For the rest of his kit, you can of course use Chirinka Pillar as you please, and then if you want to, you can group up enemies with your 2, but it's not necessary. And then having his 3 on of course doesn't hurt with the status protection, but as I said in the previous chapter, I also think it's not all that necessary in day-to-day gameplay. So mainly this whole build is focused on running around in his 4 and dealing as much damage as possible. Pretty much as easy as it gets. If you want to use a helmet ability, then you can either put it over his 2nd or his 3rd skill, depending on your personal preferences. But alright, let's now finally talk about the build itself, and the first thing I want to go over here is fixing his main issue with the new augment, that being that he is incredibly slow. First of all, there is one very important factor that we need to be totally clear about, and that is the difference between sprint speed and movement speed. Sprint speed, as the name suggests, influences how fast we are while we are sprinting. There are a whole lot of upgrades in the game that influence your sprint speed, and if you use multiple of them, then you're going to be very, very speedy. The problem with this is that the sprint speed really only applies while you're sprinting, but not while you're normally jogging or walking, meaning while you are in your 4 with Qorvex, sprint speed unfortunately doesn't get you anywhere. What we need here is movement speed. Now, when it comes to movement speed, there is one huge problem, and that is, unlike sprint speed, where we have 50 gajillion mods that we could throw on our Warframe to make them sprint faster, for movement speed, there isn't really anything that we can do directly on our Warframe. Instead, what we have to do is go for specific weapon mods and weapon effects that we can stack on top of each other, like for example, using a melee with Dispatch Overdrive in the Excellence slot, which makes it that you get 60% movement speed after a heavy attack with that melee weapon hits an enemy. Or something else, for example, you could use Nezha's skill Firewalker as a helmet ability, which, as long as it's on, will give you plus 25% movement speed. Unfortunately not scaling with ability strength, it will just be set to 25 no matter what, but at least it's something. And then there is a whole plethora of different melee weapons that also have a passive that gives you more movement speed. Some of them are Incarnons, some of them are just normal melee weapons, but surprisingly, the best out of all of them is the very recent Dual Visses, about which I also made a video on this channel, because this has a very easy to trigger ability that will give you up to 40% more movement speed. That is a whole lot, especially if you combine it with the 60% from Dispatch Overdrive, plus maybe even 25% extra from Nezha's Firewalker. As you can also see in the background right here, the Visses alone will already make us so much faster while we are in our 4, making the whole build much more fun to play, and I would super duper recommend playing the Visses on Qorvex going forward. It's just the best melee weapon you could possibly put on him. But alright, so much for the movement. However, before we talk about the build itself, there is another topic that we need to get into, and that would be energy sustain. See, as you can imagine, having his 4th ability on constantly will suck you absolutely dry when it comes to energy. And what's even worse here is, as I just said in the last chapter, building more ability duration doesn't even reduce the energy drain, so we need to make sure that we have a massive energy supply, and if you ask me, there are basically 2 viable tactics that we could do here. The first one, and unfortunately also a very expensive one because it costs around 1,000 platinum at the moment, would be the brand new Arcane Universal Fallout, which makes it that when an enemy dies, they will have a 6% chance to drop a universal health orb for every radiation status effect that has been on them. So, in other words, with Qorvex, you're likely going to have 10 radiation procs on the enemy when they die, meaning a 60% chance to drop you a universal orb, and that means especially in missions with very high enemy density, you will be showered in health and energy, will not have to worry about it at all. The problem just being that this thing costs 1,000 platinum. I bought it today so I could show it to you in this video, and believe me, it did hurt my wallet. But don't worry, the good news here is there is a much cheaper alternative to basically have the same effect, and that would be, instead of going PrimeFlo for the maximum energy, and then Arcane Universal Fallout for the energy refill, you can basically turn the whole thing around and use Equilibrium as a mod for the energy refill, and then Arcane Battery for the maximum energy. Or you just use 2 mods, Equilibrium and PrimeFlo. There are multiple combinations, and they're all going to be much cheaper than this new Arcane. Only downside, of course, with the new Arcane, you're completely independent, whereas with Equilibrium, you're kind of relying on your companion with Synth Deconstruct, and when your companion goes down or they just bug out for a couple seconds, then your energy will also run out very quickly. With Arcane Universal Fallout though, this is not a problem. But okay, let's finally get into the build, starting out with the Archon shards, and here we actually have quite a lot of options. What I personally did here is go for 2 yellows into more casting speed, because I like to use my 2 quite a bit, and without casting speed it's a bit cringe to play. But if you don't like the 2, then you don't have to go for casting speed here. What will increase your damage massively though are the orange shards that increase ability damage when the enemies are affected by radiation. That's basically tailor-made for Qorvex, and it's a multiplicative damage modifier, meaning the damage that it gives you is gonna have a much bigger impact than just going for more ability strength, for example. But of course, if you wanted to, you could also go for red ones into more ability strength or duration, maybe even go for purple ones to increase the effects of equilibrium, or yellow ones for convenience, like having energy filled up at the start. The choice here really is yours. Then, when it comes to the helmet ability, we also have multiple options. If you just wanted to deal the absolute maximum damage possible with your 4, then Roar is the way to go, because it not only increases weapon damage, but also ability damage, so there you go. But especially if you struggle with your energy economy, then Nourish could totally fix that for you. Firewalker from Nezha, as we just said, to get the absolute most movement speed possible. I personally think the Visas alone is already enough, but of course with Firewalker you're going to be a bit faster still. And finally, my personal preference here would be Ophthalmize from Jade. This one is very nice with Qorvex because you only have to switch it on once and then it will automatically go and slow enemies in your line of sight, as well as melt away their armor over time, which means that you will deal much more damage, and overall it's just really convenient to play. As for the build itself, today I'm going to show you 2 different variations of the same build, one going for the new Arcane Universal Fallout, and the other one with the more traditional Equilibrium way. First off, in the aura, you can of course use whatever you like. I personally though went for Corrosive Projection, already reducing enemy armor quite a bit. Growing Power, I don't think it's all that great because most of the time you will be using your abilities to deal damage, meaning you're not going to have this buff up constantly. And very important, don't go for Energy Siphon, don't go for Dreamer's Bond. These types of energy refills don't work on channeled abilities, meaning as long as your 4 is on, this effect will be completely negated. As for the main portion of the build, I focused on having relatively high ability strength, so we deal more damage, with Transient Fortitude, Energy Conversion, Power Drift in the Exiles, and then Triple Umbral with Fiber Vitality and Intensify, so that Umbral Intensify will give us a whopping 77% more ability strength, plus Mold Augmented in the second Arcane slot. This, all in all, will be very nice and end us up at around 300% ability strength once all the buffs are up. Just note that you could potentially also use Blind Rage here, but since the energy drain per second of your 4th ability for some reason scales only with efficiency and not with duration at all, in my testing it happened quite a lot that even though I had Arcane Universal Fallout plus Primed Flow, I just ran out of energy anyway. That's why I went for Energy Conversion instead, but of course if you were to use, let's say, Nourish as your helmet ability, then I think Blind Rage would be absolutely no problem either. And then finally, I also added Stretch to have a little bit more ability range, mainly so that the explosions from our 4th ability are bigger and hit more enemies, but I think Qorvex is fine even at base range, so if you have any other preferences here, you're more than welcome to use something else here. This right here then would be a screenshot of the full build using the new Arcane Universal Fallout plus Primed Flow. However, if you want to go for the cheaper Equilibrium variant, then this is how it would look like. Arcane Battery for the maximum energy and then Equilibrium instead of Primed Flow. And of course, if you think that you don't need all that much health and armor that I have here, you don't have to go with Triple Umbral. You could also always go with Double Umbral and use something completely different in the last slot then. So much for the builds. However, before we end the video, I also quickly want to talk about companions because there are quite some nice options for Qorvex here. For example, naturally, since your 4th ability is stronger the more enemies are clumped together, that means Nautilus to group the enemies up for you would be amazing and it works really well. Just make sure to give him a weapon like the Tazakor or something that can hit multiple enemies at the same time so you can status prime them to reduce the cooldown for the grouping ability through Manifold Bond. Alternatively, especially if you're going for the Equilibrium variant, then I would recommend going for the Panzerwolperpfeiler, who not only will viral prime the enemies and make them much weaker to your damage, but also because the Wolperpfeiler spreads this effect so easily, that means with Synth Deconstruct, you're gonna generate a whole lot of health orbs to fuel your Equilibrium, and that is really nice. However, and this is actually really funny, because you're mainly gonna deal your damage with your 4, you could also just go and use Shade to make you invisible, because Shade's invisibility is only broken when you use your weapons, but your 4 doesn't count as a weapon, it's just an ability, so you can theoretically blast away everything, like you also see in the background right here, without even being visible to the enemy. If you ask me, that's also really hilarious, especially if you want to use your Qorvex in higher level content where enemies deal a lot of damage. I would say it's probably better to not even be visible in the first place, and then Shade, or the Huras Kubro, which does basically the same thing, are your best friends. Just note here, even though I'm personally a big fan of Arcane Crepuscular, which increases your crit damage whenever you're invisible, that unfortunately doesn't work here, because your 4th ability can't crit, so even if you are invisible, Arcane Crepuscular doesn't really make all that much sense here. And in case you like big red numbers, then also don't miss my recent Atlas guide right here. Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Cell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nos Linux Gaming, Turtle Pier, Like and Shepherd, Anakanio2, Pepperwolf, Mihawky, Phil the Meme, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.